So we're continuing on with our series on anxiety, and we've got a couple more that we're going to do on this whole entire topic. Then we're going to move on to something completely different. But again, as I've done for the last two, I like to give that caveat at the beginning and really talk about really what kind of anxiety and what kind of worry that I'm referring to. There's obviously in some cases where we find people who have so much anxiety and worry that it becomes really debilitating for their life. They're unable to go to work. They're unable to do life as usual because anxiety and worry is so overwhelming in their life. And so they need therapy, they need counseling, they need somebody to help them through the journey. And sometimes they need medication in order to help them. And I'm not a counselor, I'm not a psychiatrist, I can't prescribe medication. And so when we talk about that sort of debilitating sense of anxiety and worry, that's something that we leave to professionals, right? I've got to stay in my own lane, and I'm not attempting to provide a solution to that. But what we are talking about when we talk about anxiety and worry, it's that anxiety and worry that we all experience through various parts of life. Whether it's in a transition in life, a change in life, a moment in life where maybe we feel as if we have no safety net, we have nothing to fall back on. There's a lot of unknowns, there's a lot of uncertainty in life. And it's in those moments where we all people, because this is an all human thing, this is a cross culture, a cross race, no matter what country you live in, no matter what state you live in, that you're going to experience that kind of anxiety and worry, that overwhelming feeling that you don't know what to do and you have no safety net, nothing to fall back on. It's when we have that feeling, right, of worry and anxiety that really rises up. And so keep that in mind as we talk about anxiety and worry, that's what I'm referring to when I say it, and not necessarily sort of in psychological sort of terms. Now, to get into what we're talking about today, I want to start with a question. And I haven't started with a question in a long time, and so maybe this will be sort of a breath of fresh air to some, where I start with a question, something for you to think about, something for you to ponder as we begin talking about the subject for today. But the question is this, what advice would you give to your younger self? Now, I'm not saying what would you change about your life, right, when you were younger. Now, perhaps if you follow the advice you give yourself from now to the past, maybe that would change your life a little bit. But I want you to think just more in basic terms and think about what would you tell your younger self? If your younger self was sitting in front of you, what would you tell them? What would you tell them to do a little differently with their life that would allow them to live a more full and a much better life? Now, there was a survey done, and this is the list I'm going to show you. Is not an exhaustive list. It's not in any order. It's not, this is the top one, this is number 5 or something like that. This is just a sampling of what people said when they were surveyed about what kind of things they would say to their younger self. And some of the things they would say to think before you speak. We know so many of us get in trouble because we are listening to other people to respond, right? We're not trying to understand them. And so we end up speaking before we think, right? So we don't think before you speak, right? That's what we're asking ourselves to do in our younger selves because we got ourselves into so much trouble. Or to slow down. That so many people, we just don't take time to experience life, take time to enjoy life, because we're going from one thing to another, we're going from one job to another, one country to another, one state to another, where we're not really taking in the experiences that we have in life. And so maybe you tell your younger self to slow down, or that being busy is not always a good thing. Right? So many of us in life, especially in Western culture, we're always busy. That's what the number one answer is that we tell people when someone says, "Hey, how are you doing?" Well, I've been busy. We wear that as a badge of honor and think, well, I'm being busy, that's a good thing. Well, being busy is not always a good thing, and you've come to probably find that out right now in your life, or maybe that's something you're still learning. But let's take this question and ask it a different way. Now, of course, these are things we would tell our younger self that, yes, this is what we should do, this is what we should follow, right, to live a better and more full life. But let's think about it in this way. Let's ask a different question. What advice would you give yourself right now? Now, this is going to take some introspection, maybe some honesty, and maybe it might be a hard pill to swallow. But if you were to think about yourself 10 or 15 years from now, and if that version of you 10 to 15 years from now looks back on your life right now, what advice would they give to you? Now, this actually might be an easy question to answer, simply because you're living life right now, and there are probably things that you're doing right now that you shouldn't be doing. And there are things that you're not doing right now that you should be doing. Now, this is not necessarily like a sinful thing. That's not what I'm referring to. That could be that, and we could be referring to that, and depending on your particular case. But I'm talking just more general, right? More general things that maybe we think we should be doing right now. Maybe you tell yourself, hey, you should be saving, right? Right now, maybe you're not doing that, and your older self would say, hey, in 10 to 15 years, you should have saved some money so you have that safety net to fall back on. Or maybe it's all about like relationships, making sure you invest in relationships. Maybe you're not doing that right now. Maybe you're not a people person like me, and you don't invest in relationships a lot. And so maybe your older self would say, hey, you need to invest in other people. But then maybe someone would tell you, hey, maybe you should not bottle up your feelings. Maybe you should be a person that should share your life with other people, and maybe right now we don't do that, and your older self is saying, hey, you should do this. You should be bringing other people along for the journey. And I think when we talk about anxiety, when we talk about worry, I think one of the things that I know I would tell myself if I'm looking in if I'm in the future talking to my present self, and maybe you would do the very same thing, is that, look, you don't want to do life alone. And I think when we talk about worry and anxiety, that's one of the pieces of advice that I don't think we follow too well. I mean, think about it. You probably tell a whole lot of people in your life, if they're struggling through life, you tell them, hey, I'm here for you. Talk to me if you need anything, right? If you don't want to talk to me, find someone that you can talk to. Don't do life by yourself. But we're the last people to take that advice for ourselves. We're the last people to be seen going out and going to other people and saying, hey, I'm struggling with this. I'm wrestling with this. I don't know what to do. Can you help me? And so we give this advice to so many others, but we're the last people to actually take that advice for ourselves. Now, there's probably many reasons why we do that, right? There's probably a lot of reasons, not that of the whole idea of not taking our own advice, but the fact that we want to bottle up our feelings, the fact that we want to do life on our own. I think there's a lot of reasons why we do that, but I think a lot of the reasons why, especially when we talk about anxiety and worry, why we end up wanting to do it on our own is because first and foremost, we've all been let down. I mean, look at your life. If you take an honest look at your life, you find that there are a lot of people in your life that have let you down. And if you're like me, if you've had an upbringing like me, maybe you didn't have a father figure in your life or a father, actual father in your life, who abandoned you. And so you feel, okay, that guy's let me down, the person who helped bring me into the world. And if he let me down, then it's likely that other people around me will let me down. Maybe you've shared in confidence something that was so pressing for you, something that you were dealing with. You shared it with somebody in confidence, right? You confided in them. And then somehow, some way, everybody else around you found out the thing that you were dealing with, the thing you were struggling with. So you think to yourself, I'm never bringing anybody else into the journey again because everyone else is just going to find out and nobody's really going to help me. Or at the end of the day, it's what you find is as you reach out to people, as you try to get people to come alongside you and help you, you find out that everyone just is not there for you. And so that's the struggle that we endure because then so we feel like we're let down. Now, I often find myself in that situation. I think I find myself in that when it comes to anxiety and worry, when it comes to different emotions I feel, because when I look at my life, I think, man, I have been let down a whole lot, and my tendency is, well, I just need to do it myself. But then at the end of the day, what happens is I become overworked. I become weary. I become frustrated. And I end up ultimately just feeling all alone. And so when we feel that ultimately everyone's let us down, we don't want to bring anybody onto the journey. We just want to do it ourselves. But at the end of the day, we end up just failing even more because we're doing it on our own. We're doing it in our own strength. And so maybe that's you, right? Maybe you don't share your feelings with others. Maybe you don't bring others on the journey with you because you feel like others have let you down. And then we also feel that maybe we're just unable to express our feelings. Like, I don't know what kind of family you grew up in. I don't know what kind of people you had around you when you were growing up, but like me, there were a lot of really hardened people around me. It was very rare that you found people were vulnerable with each other when it came to anxiety and worry, when it came to those more pressing emotions that we feel. A lot of times that when you saw people being vulnerable with each other is when they were yelling at each other because they were arguing over something that really at the end of the day didn't matter. And so maybe that's the kind of household you grew up in. Maybe you feel like I'm just unable to express my feelings to anybody, so you go through life not really being able to express it to anybody. And so maybe that's you. Now, if you're a follower of Jesus and you bring up that topic of anxiety and worry in some Christian circles, what you find is that some Christians don't think that you should worry or that you should have anxiety. And if you do, then there's something wrong with you. There's something that is an issue in you. The prescription has always been, if you read this Bible verse, if you just read more, if you just pray more, that, you'll solve your problem. But then I think that just leads people ultimately to doing this, right? That they feel like they're unable to express their feelings because then it always just comes down to them. That it's their problem. That it's not their situation or circumstances problem, and that God may be not in that situation with you. And so you're kind of going at it alone, and so then you feel like nobody's with you. You're not going to share your feelings with anyone. And so maybe this describes you. Maybe this is how you feel. And that seems to be real common among so many people. No matter how much we feel that that's good advice for other people to do, is to bring other people on the journey, most people just don't do it. Most people find it very difficult for us to sort of bear our feelings to other people that are around us, to bring people along for the journey. Now, if you've been with us for the last couple of weeks, you know how we've talked about anxiety and worry. And I've sort of talked about it in a way that anxiety and worry really comes down to these two words. It really comes down to our misplaced attention. That really, when we look at all of our circumstances and situations that are surrounding us, and how difficult they might be, we tend to say that we focus so much irrationally, or at least I tend to say this, that we focus irrationally many times on our situation and circumstances, that we end up making rash decisions. We end up doing things that we're going to regret for the rest of our life. And that's because we've put so much attention onto these what ifs. We put so much attention on sort of the worst case scenario, and the worst case scenario usually doesn't happen, and so we worried for nothing, thinking that if I worry, if I have anxiety, that I'm being productive, that I'm adding something to the solution. When in fact, what we find is that our attention shouldn't be placed so much on our situation, not that we shouldn't care about our situation, but that ultimately our attention should be on God, the only person who can actually make sense of everything that we're dealing with, the only person that can actually provide a solution to the things that we're working through this worry and anxiety that we're trying to address in our life. And so not only is it misplaced attention that we talked about, but we also talked about how this worry and anxiety can be used as a tool in God's hands for our good and for His glory. That's what we asked last week. We asked the question, could my anxiety and my worry actually serve a purpose? Now, most people know this in our church, that I don't like the phrase that there's always a reason. We often share that sort of phrase and sort of we try to be meaningful with it when we share it at our funeral and say, well, there's got to be a reason why this happened. And I don't know if that's necessarily the correct way to look at the things of the world or the way God is doing things. Like, I don't know if we should say with our anxiety and worry that there's always a reason behind it. But I think what we can say is that God can use any situation that happens, no matter how tragic, no matter how great it is, that God can use all of those situations for our good and for His glory. Like, God can turn evil for good. Right? He can take bad situations and turn them into a good thing for us. Right? He can take lemons, as the common phrase we like to say, take lemons and actually make lemonade out of it. And so we know that's the case, that God can use our anxiety and worry as a tool, right, to shape us, mold us, and form us into the people of God that He wants us to become. Right? And so that's what we've talked about sort of these last 2 weeks. And it's this journey that God has us on, right? This journey where we're able to, right, and we have the freedom to be able to come to God openly and freely, willingly, all of those sort of descriptors, to come to Him and share this journey with Him. And what we know, that while we're on this journey with Him, that He is so patient with us, that He's so gracious to us, to walk alongside us, that sometimes in our stubbornness, Sometimes in our inability to understand, actually many times our inability to understand what he's doing or what his purposes are in the midst of our situation, that he's still gracious with us, that he's still patient with us. But it's in the midst of all of that that God gives us the space to be able to express how it is that we feel. You know, oftentimes how we refer to this is that when we have some pressing question about life, about our own life, or about the world in general, is that we can actually come to God and be honest with him. We often refer to this as like wrestling with God. That whatever thing you're dealing with, whatever doubt, whatever question, whatever hesitancy, right, that you have about God, about this journey he has you on, that we can actually come to him and actually wrestle with him over these issues that we have. And this is the story that we're talking about today. It's one of the more famous stories of the Bible. I'm not so sure it's the claim to fame for this particular character in this story, but it's a famous story that this character is a part of. But he wrestles like literally and physically with God. And in that moment, right, he finds out a lot about himself, finds out a lot about God, and finds that in his own anxiety and stress that God is in the midst of it all, and God can actually use that for his good and for his own glory. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with this story, but this goes all the way back. We're going to Genesis chapter 32. And just to give you a little background in all of this, the main character in this story is a man named Jacob. Now, Jacob is the grandson of Abraham, and many of us know who Abraham is, all the way back in Genesis 12 when he's introduced to us, and he's going to be the father of many nations. This is what God promises him. Father of many nations. He's going to have descendants, and even in their old age, they're actually going to be able to bear children. And that's what we see, right? That Abraham has Isaac and Ishmael, and then after that, you have Jacob and Esau. Now, I said earlier that this story that we're talking about today may not necessarily be Jacob's claim to fame. He's most famous for, I think, at least whenever I think about Jacob, he's most famous for the whole story where he tricks his brother Esau into giving him his birthright. Now, that to you might not seem so serious, but I think it was a very serious thing, and we're not going to go into how serious this actually was, but the way we know that it was a very serious thing is because when we get to that story, when you get to the end of it, after Esau has figured out that his own brother Jacob has sort of betrayed him and tricked him and taken his birthright, what Esau says of his brother, he says, look, the days of mourning for my father are near. So his father was old, right? So the father Isaac was older, and so he's getting towards the end of his life. He says, after I'm done mourning, then I will kill my brother Jacob. So we know how serious, right, this whole stealing the birthright was. And so after this happens, we don't hear much about Esau, but we hear a lot about Jacob. So Jacob goes off, and there's a lot of things that happen in his life, ups and downs that he experiences throughout life. But then we get to a point in the story where God actually turns to Jacob and says, hey, I want you to go back, and I want you to see your brother. Right? I want you to go back to the land, right, of your forefathers, and I want you to see your brother, right, or see your relatives. And the key point there was that he was going to be with him, right? That's what he told him. That's what he promised him. And so we find ourselves in the story in Genesis chapter 32 as Jacob is getting ready to go meet his brother who he tricked out of his own birthright. And this is where we find him. We find Jacob in great fear and distress. And he knows he's going to go see his brother, but he doesn't know how he's going to receive him. He doesn't know how he's going to be received by his brother. He doesn't know, is his brother going to hate him still? Is his brother going to kill him? And so what Jacob does is he ends up sending messengers ahead of him. He says, go, try to give him a peace offering and try to make sure he's not that angry, or make sure he's not as angry whenever he gets to me. Messengers go and talk to Esau. They come back to Jacob, and they tell Jacob, hey, your brother's coming to see you. But he's not coming alone. He's coming with 400 men. And so for Jacob, he now gets into his mind all these what ifs. What's going to happen? Right? Is my brother going to come and kill all of my family, all of my relatives here? Or is he going to come in peace? But the worry and fear, the anxiety and distress that he's in is that I think this is going to go south. I don't think this is going to be a good thing for me. And so that's why he's in fear and great distress. That's why we find him in this particular situation. That's how we find him in this place. And so his worry and anxiety causes him to do a lot of things. He begins to divide the groups up of his family and says, okay, well, if he comes in and he hurts this group, at least there's another group that can flee, that can run away. And so his anxiety and worry ends up going to the worst case scenario. And maybe in the moment, it seems like a rational thing to do because he feels the threat is, my brother's going to kill me. And so he begins making all these sort of rash decisions, and at least in the moment seems rational, but looking back on it, maybe it was an irrational sort of decision to make. But it's this worry and anxiety that we find actually leads him to God. That ultimately what he's doing, everything he's going through right now, is not that he's going through it alone, that he's actually going through it with God. And so if we go to the story, here's how the story begins. It says, that night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched, and as he wrestled with the man. And so out of this worry and anxiety that he experiences, this what if, right, Jacob again continues to try to make all these decisions based on this worry and anxiety. And so he sends his family across the Jabbok, right, and it's just him. Right, so he knows if I die, right, then these people can live on. These people can go free. These people can go and start their own life without being hurt by my own brother. And so that's what it leads him to do. But my opinion is that a lot of his worry and anxiety really stems from what we've talked about earlier, and that's really misplaced attention. Because when we see what Jacob has gone through and what God has told him, we know all along that God was going to be with him. He tells him in chapter 31, again, go back to the land of your fathers and go back to your relatives. But see, that's not just the main promise that God gives. He gives the promise following that, and he says, look, I am going to be with you. Right? So whatever God is asking Jacob to do, wherever he's asking him to go, right, God says, I am going to be with you. And now, as we all know, I think we can find much of our story in what we see Jacob doing, what we see Jacob really struggling with. Because our anxiety and our worry, it often causes us to be short-sighted. It often causes us to forget what God has actually promised to us. I mean, that's what it does. Our anxiety and worry is so overwhelming that all we have around us is this situation and circumstance that we're going through. We don't bring in other people. We don't bring in God into the situation. We feel like we're doing this all alone. And because we feel that way, we end up again, feeling alone. Right? That's the feeling we all have, that nobody understands. Again, that's why we do it alone. We feel like God can't be with us because God is the author of good things. And so these bad things that are happening, I know he didn't cause it, but how can he be in such a bad situation? How can he actually be in my difficulties? But yet I think we see with Jacob that, again, he was very short-sighted in what he was dealing with. That God actually was with him. God had just promised him a chapter before, and we don't know how much time was in that. And between these 2 chapters, probably not much. And God is telling him, look, I am going to be with you. But yet your situation, Jacob's situation, caused him to feel like he was all alone. And that's what our worry and anxiety does to us too. That it causes us to feel like we're alone. I think what it also does is it also causes us to make those irrational decisions. Now again, in the moment, with whatever situation we're dealing with, right, the decisions we're making actually seem pretty rational. The amount of worry and anxiety that we're having, that we continue to entertain in our minds and in our souls, it seems like we're being productive. It seems like it is the rational thing to do. And of course, I'm not saying that you're never going to worry and not have anxiety. I mean, I think that's just a part of the human, being a human, living in this world. The sting of life is that we will experience it. So it all seems rational in the moment. But when we go a week after that, or maybe a few hours after that situation or circumstance, or go years off into the distance, we look back on our life and say, man, that was a terrible decision. Right? That was something I probably shouldn't have done. I shouldn't have worried as much as I did in the past. Right? We always have those kinds of questions that come up later. But yet in the moment, right, it seems like it's a rational thing, but we often make irrational decisions in the midst of the moments that we're going through. And so that's why for him, being so short-sighted, feeling like he's alone, he sends off his family. And he's like, I'm just going to do this on my own. But we see in this whole story, right, what happens? We see that in the story that he actually encounters God. That he actually comes in and he gets to see him face to face. And now in this moment, we don't know that it's God that he's wrestling. That's what we'll find at the end of the story. And in this wrestling and this fighting, we find that this man, like, he sort of hits him in the hip. And I'm sure there's some theological significance behind what that means. But that's not important or pertinent to our story today. But I'm sure it might be a mystery to some. There might be some importance to it. But again, doesn't do anything to our story today. We just know that this is what happened. So if that's a curious question for you, you probably look that up and figure that out. You can give me the answer when you figure it out. But then the story goes on, right? It says, then the man said, let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. The man asked him, what is your name? Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans, and you have overcome. And so he wrestles with this man until morning. He wrestles with him, and what does he say to him? He says, look, I am not going to let you go. I will not let you go unless you bless me. And his name has changed, right? I mean, and what a great thing. I wish God still did that today, that you experience God in such a real way that he changes your name to identify with the situation in which you had a deep and intimate encounter with God. And that's what happens with Jacob. That he's no longer referred to as Jacob, but now he is referred to Israel, because he has literally wrestled with God and he has overcome. But not only do we see that he wrestles with God, but I think that Jacob finds out a lot about himself and really even about his situation. I mean, what we find with Jacob is I think he really finds out the reality of his situation, right? Really what it is that he's going through, really what it is that he's actually struggling through. Because you see, at the beginning of the night, before he wrestles this man, he felt and believed that his greatest need was to be saved. That his greatest need was to get out of the hands of his brother. Right? And every situation, every decision that he made in that situation was for that end goal, for that purpose. Right? He had groups separated so that the line can still continue. He sent his family away so that they can live, they can continue. So even if it wasn't just his own skin, is it so his family can be rescued? That was his main concern. That was his greatest need. And I think ultimately, maybe a little selfishly, for him to save himself a little bit, is that that's what he thought, right, was the important thing. And so the worry and anxiety overwhelmed him, because he felt, my life is at risk, right? I'm going to die if I don't do something. But that's what he felt what his greatest need was. But his greatest need really comes to light as that night goes on. And he meets this man who is God. He meets this man and realizes the reality of a situation, that in the midst of his worry and anxiety, that he should actually be trusting in God in this situation. Because again, God just told him, I will be with you. But yet, being so short-sighted and being overwhelmed by his situation, he feels like God is no longer with him. That God is not in this situation. And I think that's the same for us. You know, in the moments that we experience where there's uncertainties, where there is unknowns, there isn't that safety net to fall back on, those moments where we have anxiety and worry, right? We begin to lose the truth of our situation. And that it's all us, because everybody else has let us down. That I've got to deal with this on my own. I've got to do this in my own strength. That nobody is there to help me. But yet the reality of the situation is that God has promised that he's going to be with us at all times. That even when we go to the deepest and darkest valleys, that he will be with us. Or as the psalmist says, where can I go from your spirit? Right? Where I could go to the deepest parts of hell, you're going to be there with me. Or if I go to the highest mountain, you're going to be there with me too. And so we know that in every case, in every part of life, if we're followers of Jesus, God will be with us. And so that for us determines the reality of our situation, that we're not alone. We don't do it in our own strength, as long as we do it with God. So I think that's what Jacob finds out. But then he finds out the reality, and we find the reality in those moments of anxiety and worry. We find out the reality of who we are. And I think that's what Jacob found out. I mean, again, his name was changed. Right? He wasn't just Jacob, and Jacob probably became known as someone who did trick his brother, right, out of his own birthright. So we see that all occurring, but yet then in the situation where he encounters God in a very real way, his name is changed for the better because he actually wrestled with God and he actually overcame. And so I think he finds out the reality of who he is. And I think when we come to God in the midst of our worry and anxiety, we come to find out really who it is that we are. Right? We realize that we are his children. And he is our Father who only gives us good gifts, right? And helps us through those situations in life. That we realize that we're people that God loves and deeply cares for. So he's never going to leave us alone. As much as we'd love to do things on our own, as much as we'd like to feel like we're all alone, that we can't bear our feelings to anyone, that we can actually turn to God because he is our good Father, we can actually turn to him and actually bear our entire feelings to him. But I think we have to get to a place like Jacob did. We have to be able to ask that question, like, are we desperate enough to seek God in the same way that Jacob did? Now for Jacob, I mean, he's all alone, and yes, God makes the initial, his initial presence sort of known to him, and they began to wrestle. But he says at the end of this fight, he says, look, I will not let you go unless you bless me. Are we desperate enough to not look at God as just like after I've already exhausted all of my other resources, that finally I'll come to God? But are willing to say in the midst of our worry and anxiety, look, God, you're the only one who can make sense of the things that I'm going through. You're the only one that can provide the solution for what I'm going through. And so I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. I'm not going to let you go until you do something. That's how desperate he was, and that's how desperate we need to be. Then the story goes on. Jacob said, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask me my name? Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it's because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. So Jacob, he wrestles God. He finds at the end of all of this and proclaims, look, who I actually wrestled here wasn't just a man, but it was God himself. Now, I always love this story because it always causes me to think back to myself as a kid, when I would always wrestle my grandfather. So I didn't have a father growing up, and my grandfather was my father figure, and oftentimes as a kid, and I'm sure I'm not the only kid who did this, I'm sure when you were a kid there was probably an older adult, maybe a grandfather or a father, that you would often like wrestle with or something and think that you're stronger than them. And I remember my grandfather, and I can remember it clear as day, and I remember just fighting with him. He would always make these karate sounds, that you would find in any sort of exaggerated sort of karate movie, karate chopping me, and obviously not in a hurtful sort of way. I would do the same thing to him, and, at the end of the whole thing, I would always end up losing, right? He would always be the one that would win. He would be the one that would always overpower me. But see, when I think about all of that, I actually come to know a whole lot about myself and come to know a lot about who he is. Like, I realized in those moments that as a little kid that I don't have the strength to overpower him. And he was a bigger guy. I mean, he had some I think he got polio when he was a kid, so he wasn't as tall as he should be, so he had some issues with his legs, and he already looked strong. I was taller than him, but he looked strong already. And then if he was his normal height, he'd probably be like 6 foot or something, and I can't imagine how scary that would be. But I think back to that, and I think, man, even in his own stature, though, he was stronger than I was. So I realized something about myself, that I'm not as strong as I thought I was. But then I think about him, and that he's so strong, but he is never going to hurt me. He's never going to have ill intentions toward me. So even though he'll always win in the end, even though he's always going to be the one to hold me down, right, I know he has no ill intentions toward me. And when I think about that story, I think about God. Because when we look at God and when we look at this wrestling with him, when we bring in our emotions, when we bring in our questions, when we bring in our doubts to God, we realize that, look, no question that we're going to give him is going to be something that's too hard for him. Something that he can't provide a sufficient answer to. But in the midst of all of that, what we find is that when God does come, and God does come into that wrestling match with us, which, by the way, you can't wrestle with God, you can't wrestle with any other human from far away. When you wrestle with God, that's got to be an intimate thing. There's closeness to that. But we know that when God comes and he wrestles with us, that he's not going to fight us so hard that we think he's got some ill intentions toward us. But know that he cares and loves each and every one of us. And that ultimately what we find is that in that wrestling with God, that we actually have a whole lot of security. That's often why I think I would wrestle my grandfather, is because I felt that within that, he had no ill intentions toward me, but I felt in him, I felt safe. And I think that's what we feel in God as well. And that's not to say that we can't experience that in other places in the world with other people that we can trust, but we know that's only momentary. We know that that's imperfect. We know that people can still let us down. And so I'm not saying, though, don't trust other people around you. But what I'm saying that in the midst of all of that, we have to realize that there is only one person, because we can find true security in him, we can find true safety in him, that we can come to him and bear all of our feelings to him and know that we're not going through life alone, that we're going through life with him at our center. And I know that's difficult for us, because it's hard enough for us to share our feelings and to want to do life with people that we can see, let alone to do it with someone that we cannot see. But it's the testimony of the Bible and the testimony of so many people's lives that we see God's faithfulness. That we see that when he says he's going to be with you, he's always going to be with you. When he says he's going to be there, that he's actually going to be there with you. And so we got to ask ourselves the question. In our moments of worry and anxiety, are we desperate enough to hang on to God? To wrestle with him in the midst of those moments? To say, God, I will not let you go unless you bless me. I will not let you go unless you do something. I will not let you go unless you make sense of the things that I'm dealing with. I will not let you go unless you lead me and guide me through these hard and difficult moments of my life. Let's pray. Well, God, thank you so much for your love and your care. Thank you, Lord, that you are with us. And that's the great promise of the Bible that we see throughout the Psalms especially, that so many of them went through so many situations of distress and fear and anxiety and worry. They question you, they bring their doubts to you, but at the end of the day they say, look, I will still trust in you. Because so many writers of the Bible looked at you as that strong fortress, that foundation, that safety that we can only find in you. So you are my rock, you are our fortress. Whom shall I fear? Lord, let that be our prayer today. Lord, that you can be and that you are our rock and our fortress, that you're the thing that provides security, you're the thing that provides safety, and you can bear whatever questions, doubts, and emotions that we have and we want to throw at you. And by doing that, Lord, we know that we're not alone. We know that you're always with us. So help us, Lord, not just to trust people around us, but to be able to trust you with those situations and circumstances that we face every day. They cause us to worry. They cause us to have anxiety. Lord, be with us as we continue to work through these areas of our lives. And Lord, we pray that at the end of it all, that you would be glorified. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.